The bell above the diner door chimed softly, a sound so familiar it barely registered anymore. Outside, the November rain had turned the streets into rivers of grey, washing the colour from everything it touched. Inside, the warmth was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon, the kind of place where time moved differently, where the clock on the wall had been stuck at 3:47 for as long as anyone could remember. Clifford Burns pushed through the door with the careful movements of a man whose body had betrayed him long ago. His jacket was military surplus, the kind you could pick up at any thrift store for $5. But the way he wore it suggested it had never left his shoulders. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, patched in places with mismatched thread. His boots left wet prints on the linoleum, the soles so worn they barely had tread left. He took the corner booth without asking, the one by the window where the vinyl was split and repaired with duct tape. The rain streaked down the glass beside him, distorting the world outside into something unrecognizable. He sat with his back to the wall, an old habit that had never died, and placed his hands flat on the table. They trembled slightly, not from fear or cold, but from something deeper, something that lived in his bones now. Peggy Martinez had been working at Rosie's diner for exactly 3 weeks. She was 22, fresh out of community college, with a degree in hospitality management and dreams that hadn't yet been crushed by reality. The job was supposed to be temporary, just until something better came along, but she was learning that temporary had a way of becoming permanent when you weren't paying attention. She grabbed a menu from the stack by the register and approached the corner booth, her smile already in place, the one she'd practiced in the mirror until it looked natural. But when she got close enough to see him clearly, the smile faltered. The man in the booth looked like he'd been carved from old wood and left out in the weather too long. His face was a map of lines, each one telling a story she couldn't read. His hair was white, cut military short, and his eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and distant. There was something about him that made her want to look away, not from disgust, but from the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing something she wasn't meant to see. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice too bright, compensating. He nodded once, a movement so slight it barely qualified as acknowledgement. She poured from the pot she'd been carrying, watching the dark liquid fill the chipped ceramic mug. He didn't reach for sugar or cream, just wrapped both hands around the cup, as if drawing warmth from it. His fingers were scarred, the knuckles enlarged and crooked, the hands of someone who'd worked with them his entire life. "You know what you want, or do you need a minute?" Peggy asked, setting the menu down in front of him. "Apple pie," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel being turned over. "If you got it." "We do. Heated up." "Cold's fine." She wrote it down on her pad even though she didn't need to, a habit from training. "That'll be it. That'll be it." Peggy walked back to the counter, sliding the order slip through the window to the kitchen. Manny, the cook, glanced at it and nodded, already reaching for the pie case. She busied herself refilling salt shakers, wiping down the counter, anything to avoid looking back at the corner booth. There was something about the old man that unsettled her, though she couldn't name what it was. The diner was nearly empty. Tuesday afternoons were always slow, the dead zone between lunch and dinner, when the only customers were the ones with nowhere else to be. At the far end of the counter sat Harold Finch, a regular who came in every day at 2:30 and ordered the same thing, black coffee and a slice of lemon meringue. He was reading the newspaper, the physical kind, turning the pages with deliberate care. The pie came up in the window, a generous slice with a scoop of vanilla ice cream melting slowly on top. Peggy carried it over, setting it down in front of Clifford Burns with a fresh napkin and fork. "Anything else I can get you?" He shook his head, already cutting into the pie with the side of his fork. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Thank you." 2 words, but they carried weight, as if gratitude was something he didn't give lightly. Peggy nodded and retreated to the safety of the counter. Through the window, she watched him eat slowly, methodically, the way someone eats when they're not sure when the next meal is coming. It made something twist in her chest, a feeling she didn't want to examine too closely. 15 minutes passed. The pie was gone, the ice cream reduced to a white puddle in the bottom of the plate. Clifford Burns drained the last of his coffee and raised one hand slightly, the universal signal for a check. Peggy tore off the slip from her pad and brought it over. $3.75. She set it face down on the table beside his empty plate. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a wallet, so worn the leather had gone soft as cloth. It was held together with a rubber band, the kind that comes wrapped around newspapers. He opened it carefully, as if the contents might spill out, and extracted a single bill. Peggy reached for it automatically, her fingers closing around the paper before she really looked at it. When she did, she froze. The bill was old, not just old, but ancient, the kind of old that made you wonder how it had survived this long. The paper was soft and fragile, discolored to a yellowish brown, with dark stains along one edge that might have been oil or blood, or just the accumulated grime of decades. The edges were frayed, torn in places, and there was a crease down the middle so deep it looked like the bill might split in half if you weren't careful. But it was the color that caught her attention first. Instead of the familiar green of modern currency, this bill had red ink. The serial number was printed in red, and the treasury seal was red, and across the top, in ornate lettering, it said "Silver Certificate." Peggy had never seen anything like it. "I can't take this," she said, holding the bill away from her body as if it might contaminate her. Clifford Burns looked up at her with those winter sky eyes. "It's legal tender. It's filthy, and I don't even know if it's real." "It's real. Sir, I really can't." "Check the serial number." His voice was calm, patient, the tone of someone who'd had this conversation before. Peggy hesitated. The diner had a policy about suspicious bills, though it mostly applied to 50s and 100s. She was supposed to use the counterfeit pen, but she'd left it at the register. And anyway, this didn't look like a counterfeit. It looked like something that had crawled out of a museum. "The serial number," Clifford repeated, his voice a little firmer now. "Just check it." She turned the bill over in her hands, looking for the number. It was there, printed in red ink along the top right corner. A238639A. Below it, in smaller print, Series 1923. 1923. The bill was over 100 years old. Peggy's heart started beating faster. She didn't know much about old currency, but she knew enough to understand that something this old might be valuable, maybe very valuable. And if it was valuable, then taking it for a $3.75 check was either incredibly stupid or incredibly illegal. "I need to talk to my manager," she said, backing away from the booth. "You do that." Peggy hurried to the back office, where Rita Alvarez was doing paperwork, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Rita had been managing Rosie's for 15 years and had seen everything the job could throw at her, from kitchen fires to health inspectors to customers who tried to pay with monopoly money. "Rita, I need help." Rita looked up, immediately reading the panic in Peggy's face. "What happened?" "There's a guy in the corner booth. He's trying to pay with this." She held out the bill. Rita took it, her expression shifting from concern to confusion to something that might have been recognition. She held the bill up to the light, examining it closely, then set it down on the desk and pulled out her phone. "Where'd he get this?" "I don't know. He just pulled it out of his wallet." Rita was typing on her phone, her thumbs moving quickly across the screen. Peggy watched over her shoulder as Rita pulled up a website about collectible currency. She typed in the serial number, then waited while the page loaded. The result made Rita's eyebrows climb toward her hairline. "Holy shit," she whispered. What is it?" Rita turned the phone so Peggy could see. The screen showed an image of a bill identical to the one on the desk, along with a description and estimated value. 1923. Mahal silver certificate, red seal. Estimated value, $150 here, $500 depending on condition. But that wasn't what made Rita swear. Below the description was a note in red text. Bills with documented historical provenance or notable signatures can be worth significantly more. Authentication required. "Look at the corner," Rita said, pointing to the bill. "Bottom left." Peggy leaned in closer. There, in faded blue ink, so light she'd missed it the first time, was a signature. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the letters looping and elegant, but she could just make out the name, Franklin D. Roosevelt. The room seemed to tilt sideways. "That can't be real," Peggy said. "I don't know, but if it is..." D. Rita trailed off, staring at the bill as if it might suddenly burst into flames. "What do we do?" Rita was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then she picked up the bill, handling it carefully, and walked out of the office. Peggy followed, her heart hammering in her chest. Clifford Burns was still sitting in the corner booth, his hands folded on the table, waiting. He didn't look impatient or annoyed, just calm, as if he had all the time in the world. Rita slid into the booth across from him, setting the bill on the table between them. Peggy stood to the side, feeling like an intruder in a conversation she didn't understand. "Mr. Rita began. "Burns, Clifford Burns." "Mr. Burns, this bill, where did you get it?" "It was given to me." "By who?" Clifford's eyes shifted to the window, watching the rain. "Someone who thought I earned it." Rita leaned forward. "Sir, I don't know if you're aware, but this bill is potentially very valuable. If that signature is authentic, it's authentic. Then you shouldn't be using it to pay for pie. You should have it appraised, authenticated. It could be worth thousands." "I know what it's worth." The certainty in his voice stopped Rita cold. She exchanged a glance with Peggy, then looked back at Clifford. "Then why are you trying to spend it?" "Because it's money, and money's meant to be spent." Rita opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was a logic to his words that was hard to refute, even if it made no practical sense. "Can you at least tell me how you got it?" Rita asked. "The story might be important, for authentication." Clifford was quiet for so long that Peggy thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. 1944. I was 20 years old, fresh off the boat in England, waiting to ship out to France. I was a private, didn't know my ass from my elbow, scared out of my mind but trying not to show it. We were bivouacked outside London, sleeping in tents, waiting for orders. His voice had changed, becoming distant, as if he was seeing something they couldn't. One night, there was a commotion. Brass coming through, inspecting the troops. We all scrambled to look presentable, but we were a mess. Mud everywhere, equipment falling apart, half of us sick with something or other. And then he walked into our tent. Who? Peggy asked, unable to help herself. Clifford's eyes focused on her, and for a moment she felt like he was looking through her, into the past. The President! The words hung in the air like smoke. Roosevelt was touring the bases, Clifford continued. Morale visit, they called it. He came through in his wheelchair, Secret Service all around him. But he insisted on meeting the men, shaking hands, asking names, that sort of thing. When he got to me, I was so nervous I could barely speak. He asked me where I was from and I told him Nebraska. He smiled and said his wife had cousins in Omaha. Clifford's hands, which had been still on the table, began to move, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the worn vinyl. Then he asked me if I was scared, and I said yes, sir, I was. And he said that was good, that being scared meant I understood what was at stake. He said courage wasn't about not being afraid, it was about doing what needed to be done anyway. Rita was leaning forward now, completely absorbed. Even Harold Finch at the counter had put down his newspaper and was listening. Before he left, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a $1 bill and signed it, right there in front of me. He said it was for luck, that I should keep it with me, and that when I got home, I should spend it on something that made me happy. He said that's what we were fighting for. The right to come home and be happy. The rain against the window was the only sound for several heartbeats. I kept it, Clifford said quietly. Carried it through France, through Germany, through everything that came after. It was in my pocket at Normandy. It was in my pocket at the Bulge. It got soaked in blood and mud and God knows what else, but I never spent it. I told myself I was saving it for something special, something that would make me happy like he said. His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, but I never found that thing, never found what I was supposed to spend it on. And now I'm 81 years old, and I figure if I don't spend it soon, I never will. So I'm spending it on pie, because pie makes me happy. The silence that followed was profound. Peggy felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back furiously. Rita was staring at Clifford Burns with an expression that was part awe, part heartbreak. Mr. Burns, Rita said softly, you can't spend this. Not here. Not like this. Why not? Because it's not just money, it's history. It's a piece of something bigger than any of us. History doesn't pay the bills. No, but... Rita stopped, searching for words. This bill could be in a museum. It could teach people about the war, about sacrifice, about what that generation went through. It's important. Clifford looked at her with those pale eyes, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there before. Sadness, maybe, or resignation. I don't want to be in a museum, he said. I just want to pay for my pie. Before Rita could respond, Harold Finch stood up from his stool at the counter. He was a tall man, thin and angular, with silver hair combed straight back and glasses that magnified his eyes slightly. He walked over to the booth with the careful steps of someone who'd spent a lifetime being precise. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice cultured, the accent vaguely British. "I couldn't help but overhear. May I?" He gestured to the bill on the table. Rita looked at Clifford, who shrugged, and she pushed the bill toward Harold. He picked it up with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact, holding it up to the light, examining it from every angle. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "Absolutely extraordinary." "You know about old currency?" Rita asked. "I'm a collector. Have been for 40 years. Mostly coins, but I dabble in paper money as well." He set the bill down carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. "This is genuine. No question. The paper, the ink, the printing style, all consistent with 1923 silver certificates. But the signature..." He trailed off, pulling out his own phone and taking several photographs of the bill, zooming in on the signature in the corner. "If this is authentic, and I believe it is, this bill is worth considerably more than a few $100. With documented provenance, with the story Mr. Burns just told us, this could be worth tens of thousands, perhaps more." Peggy's knees went weak. She grabbed the edge of the booth to steady herself. "Tens of thousands?" Rita repeated. Harold nodded. Roosevelt rarely signed currency. There are only a handful of documented cases, and most of those bills are in private collections or museums. One with a verified military connection with a story like this. He looked at Clifford with something approaching reverence. "Sir, this is a national treasure." Clifford Burns didn't react. He just sat there, his hands folded on the table, his expression unreadable. "I don't care," he said finally, "but I don't care what it's worth. I don't care if it belongs in a museum. It's mine, and I'm spending it on pie." The finality in his voice was absolute. Harold opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, recognizing the futility. "At least let me buy it from you," Harold said. "I'll give you fair market value, more than fair. Name your price. It's not for sale." "Mr. Burns, please, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. I'm a customer. I ordered pie. I'm paying for it. That's how this works." Rita looked helplessly at Peggy, who looked helplessly back. The situation had spiraled so far beyond a simple transaction that neither of them knew how to proceed. "Tell you what," Clifford said, his voice softening slightly. "You want to make this right? You want to do something with this bill that matters? Then take it, frame it, put it on the wall. Tell people the story, but first let me pay for my damn pie." Rita stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. She picked up the bill, handling it like it might shatter, and walked to the register. She rang up the order, $3.75, and made change from her own wallet, pulling out a $5 bill and bringing back the difference. When she set the money on the table in front of Clifford, he pushed it back toward her. "Keep it," he said, "for the trouble. Mr. Burns, I can't." "You can, and you will." He slid out of the booth, moving with the careful slowness of age and old injuries. "Thank you for the pie. It was good." He was halfway to the door when Peggy found her voice. "Wait!" He stopped, turning back to look at her. "Why?" she asked. "Why now? Why here? If you've been carrying that bill for 80 years, why spend it on pie in a random diner?" Clifford Burns smiled for the first time since he'd walked through the door. It was a small smile, sad around the edges, but genuine. "Because I'm tired," he said simply. Tired of carrying the past around. Tired of waiting for the perfect moment that never comes. Roosevelt told me to spend it on something that made me happy, and I finally did. That's all. He pushed through the door, and the bell chimed again, and then he was gone, disappearing into the rain like a ghost. The three of them, Rita, Peggy, and Harold, stood in silence, staring at the door. On the table, the bill lay where Rita had left it, a fragile piece of history that had somehow ended up in a roadside diner on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. "We should go after him," Peggy said. "We should make sure he's okay." Rita shook her head. "He doesn't want that. He wants to be left alone." "But he's old and it's raining and he's a grown man who made his choice." Rita picked up the bill again, holding it up to the light. "We'll honor it. We'll do what he asked. We'll tell the story." Harold Finch cleared his throat. "If I may make a suggestion, I have contacts at the Smithsonian. They have a division dedicated to military history. With your permission, I could reach out to them, see if they'd be interested in acquiring this for their collection. The story would be preserved. Mr. Burns would be remembered." Rita considered this, then nodded slowly. "I think he'd like that, being remembered. I'll make the calls tomorrow." Harold returned to his stool at the counter, but he didn't pick up his newspaper again. He just sat there, staring into his coffee, lost in thought. Peggy started clearing the table in the corner booth, stacking the empty plate and mug on her tray. As she wiped down the vinyl, she noticed something she'd missed before. Carved into the table, so faint it was almost invisible, were initials: CB 1945. He'd been here before, maybe many times. This booth, this diner, had meant something to him, and she'd almost turned him away over a dirty bill. The thought made her chest ache. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. The rain continued through the afternoon and into the evening. By the time Peggy's shift ended at 8, the streets were flooded and the sky was the color of bruises. She drove home slowly, her windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour, thinking about Clifford Burns and the bill and the weight of history. When she got to her apartment, she didn't turn on the TV or check her phone. She just sat on her couch in the dark, listening to the rain, and thought about all the stories walking around in the world, hidden inside ordinary people, waiting to be told. The next morning, Rita called Peggy before her shift started. "Turn on the news," Rita said without preamble. "What? Why? Just do it." Peggy fumbled for the remote and clicked on the TV. The local news was on, and the anchor was in the middle of a story. Identified as Clifford Burns, age 81, a decorated World War II veteran. Burns was found unresponsive in his apartment early this morning by a neighbor. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities say he appears to have died peacefully in his sleep. The remote slipped from Peggy's hand. The screen cut to footage of a small apartment building, police cars, and an ambulance parked outside. Then it cut to a photograph, an old military portrait of a young man in uniform, his face unlined and hopeful, his eyes bright with youth. Clifford Burns, 20 years old, a lifetime ago. "The family has requested privacy," the anchor continued, "but they've released a statement saying that Mr. Burns was a proud veteran who served his country with honor and asked for nothing in return. A memorial service will be held at the Veterans Cemetery on Saturday." The screen cut to commercial, and Peggy sat frozen on her couch, unable to move, unable to think. He'd known. Yesterday, when he walked into the diner, when he ordered pie and paid with a 100-year-old bill, he'd known it was the end. He'd been saying goodbye. She called Rita back, her hands shaking. "Did you see?" "I saw." "He knew. Rita, he knew. I know." They were both quiet for a moment, the weight of it settling over them like snow. "What do we do?" Peggy asked. "We do what he asked. We tell the story." Harold Finch moved faster than Peggy would have thought possible for a man his age. By Thursday, he'd contacted the Smithsonian, sent them photographs and documentation, and arranged for a curator to come examine the bill in person. By Friday, the curator had arrived, a severe-looking woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Keene, who spent 3 hours examining the bill under various lights and magnifications. Her verdict was unequivocal, authentic. "This is an extraordinary find," she said, carefully placing the bill in a protective sleeve. "The signature is genuine, the provenance is documented, and the story is verifiable. We'd be honored to include this in our collection." "What happens now?" Rita asked. "We'll create an exhibit, a small one but prominent. The bill will be displayed alongside Mr. Burns's military records, photographs, and the story of how it came to be. It will be a testament to the personal connections forged during the war and to the sacrifices made by that generation. And his name? Will people know his name? Absolutely. Clifford Burns will be remembered." Dr. Keene paused, looking at Rita with something that might have been sympathy. "I understand he passed away recently." "Tuesday night, the same day he came in here." "I'm sorry for your loss. He wasn't mine to lose. I barely knew him." "Sometimes," Dr. Keene said quietly, "the people who touch our lives most deeply are the ones we barely know." The memorial service on Saturday was small. A handful of veterans from the local VFW post, a few neighbors, a representative from the city. No family. Clifford Burns had outlived everyone who'd shared his name. Peggy and Rita went together, standing at the back of the small chapel, listening to the chaplain talk about duty and honor and sacrifice. The words were well-meaning but generic, the kind of eulogy that could have been for anyone. When it was over, when the flag had been folded and presented to no one in particular, when the other mourners had drifted away, Peggy approached the casket. It was closed, polished wood with brass handles, draped with an American flag. She placed her hand on the smooth surface, feeling the coolness of it through her palm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the story, for trusting us with it." Rita came up beside her, placing her own hand on the casket. "We'll make sure people remember," she said. "I promise." They stood there for a long time, two women who'd barely known a man, mourning him anyway, because some stories demand to be mourned. 3 months later, the exhibit opened at the Smithsonian. It was small, tucked into a corner of the military history wing, but it was beautifully done. The bill was mounted in a climate-controlled case, lit from above, the signature clearly visible. Beside it was Clifford Burns's military portrait, his service record, and a placard telling the story of the day President Roosevelt gave a scared young private a signed dollar bill and told him to spend it on happiness. Below that was a photograph of Rosie's diner and a quote from Rita. He carried the past for 80 years, and when he finally let it go, he chose pie. He chose something simple and sweet and ordinary. He chose to be happy, even if only for a moment. That's the real story. Not the bill, not the signature, but the choice to finally, after all that time, let himself be happy. The exhibit became unexpectedly popular. People came to see the bill, but they stayed for the story. They read about Clifford Burns, about his service, about the day he met the president, about the decades he carried that bill through war and peace and everything in between. And they read about the end, about the diner and the pie, and the choice he made to spend his most precious possession on something that made him happy. Peggy visited the exhibit once, taking a day off work and driving to Washington. She stood in front of the case for a long time, staring at the bill, remembering the way Clifford Burns had looked sitting in that corner booth, the way his hands had trembled as he held his coffee, the way he'd smiled when he said he was tired of carrying the past. A school group came through while she was standing there, middle schoolers on a field trip, loud and restless and barely paying attention. But one girl, maybe 12 or 13, stopped in front of the exhibit and read the whole thing, her lips moving slightly as she processed the words. When she finished, she turned to her teacher. "That's sad," she said. "Why is it sad?" the teacher asked. "Because he waited so long. He should have spent it sooner. He should have let himself be happy sooner." The teacher smiled. Maybe, but maybe the waiting was part of the story too. Maybe he needed to carry it for all those years, so that when he finally let it go, it meant something. The girl considered this, then nodded slowly. "I guess." They moved on to the next exhibit, and Peggy was alone again, with the bill and the photograph and the memory of a man she'd barely known. She thought about the girl's words. He should have let himself be happy sooner. Maybe that was true. Maybe Clifford Burns had wasted decades holding on to something he should have released long ago. Or maybe the teacher was right, and the waiting had been necessary, part of the journey that made the ending meaningful. Peggy didn't know. She wasn't sure anyone could know, but she knew this. In the end, Clifford Burns had made his choice. He'd decided what his happiness looked like, and he'd claimed it, even if only for the space of a slice of pie and a cup of coffee in a roadside diner on a rainy afternoon. And that, she thought, was worth something. That was worth remembering. Back at Rosie's diner, Rita had the bill's story framed and hung on the wall near the corner booth. Not the actual bill, that was in Washington now, behind glass, part of history, but a reproduction, along with the photograph of Clifford Burns in his uniform and the text of the story. The booth became something of a landmark. People started asking for it specifically, wanting to sit where Clifford Burns had sat, wanting to order pie like he'd ordered, wanting to be part of the story, even tangentially. Rita let them. She figured Clifford would have appreciated it. The idea that his last meal had become something people sought out, something that connected them to history and sacrifice and the simple act of choosing happiness. Peggy still worked there, though she'd stopped thinking of it as temporary. She'd learned something from Clifford Burns, though she couldn't quite articulate what it was. Something about the weight of the past, about the importance of letting go, about the courage it took to choose happiness when you'd spent a lifetime carrying sorrow. She was different now, more patient with difficult customers, more willing to listen to the stories people told, even when they seemed rambling or pointless. Because you never knew. You never knew when someone was about to tell you something that mattered, something that would change the way you saw the world. One evening, about 6 months after Clifford Burns died, an old woman came into the diner and asked for the corner booth. Peggy seated her, brought her coffee, took her order. The woman was small and frail, with white hair and hands that shook when she lifted her cup. As Peggy was turning to leave, the woman spoke. "I heard about what happened here, with the veteran and the bill." Peggy turned back. "Yes, Mum. I wanted to see it, the place where it happened. It's just a booth." "No," the woman said softly. "It's more than that. It's a place where someone made a choice, where someone decided to let go of the past and choose the present, even if only for a moment. That's sacred in its way." Peggy felt tears prickling at her eyes again, the way they had that first day. "I suppose it is." The woman smiled. "My husband was in the war too. Different theatre, different battles, but the same war. He carried things too. Memories mostly, guilt. He never talked about it, but I knew. I could see it in his eyes, the weight of it." "Did he ever let it go?" "No, he died with it still on his shoulders. I used to wish he could have found a way to put it down, even for a little while. To be happy without the past hanging over him." She looked around the diner, at the worn booths and the cracked linoleum, and the clock that still read 3:47. "I'm glad your veteran found his way. I'm glad he got his moment of peace." "Me too," Peggy said. The woman ordered pie, apple, like Clifford Burns had, and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. When she was done, she left a $20 tip on a $4 check and walked out into the evening without another word. Peggy watched her go, then cleared the table, pocketing the tip and wiping down the vinyl. As she worked, she thought about all the people carrying the past, all the weight that never got put down, all the happiness deferred until it was too late. And she thought about the ones who found their moment, who made their choice, who decided that today was the day to let go and be happy, even if only for the space of a slice of pie. Those were the ones worth remembering. Those were the ones who changed the world, one small choice at a time. Years passed. The exhibit at the Smithsonian remained popular, a quiet corner of the museum that people discovered and shared, a story that resonated in ways the curators hadn't anticipated. It became a place where veterans brought their families, where history teachers brought their students, where people came to remember that the past was made up of individuals, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own moments of grace. Rosie's diner thrived. The corner booth was always full, and people came from all over to sit where Clifford Burns had sat, to order what he'd ordered, to be part of the story. Rita eventually retired, selling the diner to Peggy, who kept everything exactly as it was, including the framed story on the wall and the booth that had become a shrine. And in Washington, in a climate-controlled case in the Smithsonian, a fragile piece of paper with red ink and a faded signature continued to tell its story to anyone who would listen. A story about a young soldier and a president. A story about carrying the past and choosing the present. A story about happiness deferred and finally, at the very end, claimed. A story about a man named Clifford Burns who spent 80 years carrying a dollar bill and one afternoon deciding to spend it on pie. It wasn't a story about heroism or glory or the grand sweep of history. It was a story about something smaller and more profound. It was a story about being human. And that, in the end, was the story worth telling. The morning after Clifford Burns's memorial service, Peggy woke before dawn with a thought that wouldn't let her rest. She'd been dreaming about the corner booth, about the way Clifford's hands had trembled around his coffee cup, about the weight in his eyes when he'd said he was tired of carrying the past. She got out of bed, made coffee in the dark kitchen of her small apartment, and sat by the window watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, in filing cabinets and storage units and dusty attics, were the remnants of Clifford Burns's life. His apartment would need to be cleared. His possessions would need to be sorted, distributed, discarded, and no one was coming to claim them. The thought made her chest ache. By 7, she was dressed and in her car, driving to the address she'd found in the obituary. The apartment building was exactly what she'd expected. A low-rise complex from the 70s, beige stucco with rust stains under the gutters, a parking lot full of old cars and empty spaces. The kind of place where people ended up when they'd run out of better options. She found the manager's office on the first floor, a cramped room that smelled like cigarettes and instant coffee. The manager was a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning hair and suspicious eyes. "Help you? I'm here about Clifford Burns, apartment 2C. The man's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy. "You family?" "No, just someone who knew him." "Well, if you're not family, I can't let you in. Privacy laws and all that." Peggy had expected this. She pulled out her phone and showed him the photograph she'd taken of the framed story at the diner, the one with Clifford's military portrait and the account of the dollar bill. "He came into the diner where I work. The day before he died. He told us his story, and we promised we'd remember him. I just want to make sure nothing important gets thrown away." The manager studied the phone, then her face, weighing something in his mind. Finally, he sighed and pulled a keyring from his desk drawer. 10 minutes, that's all I can give you, and don't take anything. I'm serious about that." "I won't." He led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor, down a hallway with worn carpet and flickering fluorescent lights. Apartment 2C was at the end, the door marked with brass numbers that had oxidized to green. The manager unlocked the door and pushed it open. 10 minutes. Then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, and Peggy was alone. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The apartment was small, a studio really, with a kitchenette in one corner and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. The furniture was minimal, a narrow bed with military corners, a single chair, a card table serving as a desk. No television, no computer, just a radio on the windowsill, old enough to have dials instead of buttons. But the walls were covered in photographs. Peggy moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. They were arranged chronologically, she realized, starting at the door and moving clockwise around the room. The earliest ones were black and white, formal portraits of young men in uniform, their faces serious and unlined. Clifford was in some of them, though it took her a moment to recognize him. He looked so young, so impossibly young, his whole life ahead of him. Then came the war photos. These were different. Candid shots, grainy and poorly lit, taken with whatever cameras the soldiers could get their hands on. Men standing in front of tanks, men sitting in muddy trenches, men with their arms around each other grinning despite everything. Because what else could you do? Clifford was in many of these too. She could track his progression through the war by the changes in his face, the softness leaving his features, the hardness entering his eyes, the way his smile became more forced, more brittle, until in the later photos he wasn't smiling at all. There were photos from after the war too. Clifford in civilian clothes, standing in front of various buildings, various cities. Always alone, always with that same distant look in his eyes, as if part of him had never left France. And then, near the end of the chronological progression, the photos changed again. They became older, more faded, showing people Peggy didn't recognize. An elderly couple standing in front of a farmhouse, a young woman holding a baby, a group of children playing in a yard. She leaned closer, reading the captions written in neat handwriting on the backs of the frames. Mother and Father, 1952. Sister Margaret and her son Thomas, 1955. Nieces and nephews, 1960. Family. People who'd known him, loved him, shared his name. All of them gone now, or scattered, or simply unaware that he'd existed. Peggy felt tears burning in her eyes. This was what he'd left behind. Not wealth or property or grand achievements, just photographs, just memories, just the evidence that he'd been here, that he'd mattered to someone once. She moved to the card table that served as his desk. On it was a stack of papers, neatly organized. Bills, all paid. A will, handwritten and notarized, leaving his meager possessions to the Veterans Administration. A letter, sealed in an envelope with no address. Peggy picked up the envelope. On the front, in that same neat handwriting, were 2 words. To whoever finds this. She hesitated only a moment before opening it. The letter inside was written on lined paper, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the words chosen with care. If you're reading this, I'm gone. That's all right. I've been ready for a long time. I don't have much to leave behind. No money to speak of, no property, no family to inherit what little I have. But I have stories, I have memories, and I have one request. In the closet, you'll find a box. Inside that box are letters, hundreds of them. Letters I wrote during the war and never sent. Letters I wrote after the war, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, what I'd done. Letters to people who are dead now, or who never existed in the first place. I want them burned. All of them. I don't want anyone reading them, trying to understand me through words I wrote when I was too young or too broken to know what I was saying. But before you burn them, I want you to know this. I had a good life. Not an easy one, not a happy one by most measures, but a good one. I did what I was supposed to do. I served, I survived, I carried what needed to be carried. And at the very end, I let it go. I spent my last dollar on pie, and it was the best decision I ever made. Don't mourn me. Don't feel sorry for me. Just remember that I was here, and that I tried my best, and that in the end, I found my peace. That's all anyone can ask for. Clifford Burns. Peggy read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper into her chest. Then she carefully folded it and put it back in the envelope. She found the box in the closet, exactly where he'd said it would be. It was an old footlocker, military issue, with his name stenciled on the side. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, just like he'd said. Some in envelopes, some loose, some tied together with string. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were still there, waiting to be read. Peggy closed the box without looking at any of them. He'd asked for them to be burned, and she would honor that request. But not here. Not in this sad little apartment where he'd spent his final years. She would take them to the diner. She would burn them in the parking lot in a metal drum. And she would say a prayer or a blessing or whatever words felt right. She would give Clifford Burns the ending he'd asked for. The manager was waiting at the bottom of the stairs when she emerged, carrying the footlocker. I said, "Don't take anything." He left a letter. He wanted this burned. The manager looked at the footlocker, then at her face, and whatever he saw there made him step aside. "All right, but that's it. Nothing else leaves this building." "Nothing else," Peggy agreed. She loaded the footlocker into her trunk and drove back to the diner. Rita was already there, prepping for the lunch rush, and she came out to the parking lot when she saw Peggy pulling in. "What's that?" "Letters from Clifford Burns. He wanted them burned." Rita looked at the footlocker, then at Peggy. "You went to his apartment?" "I had to. I had to make sure nothing important got lost." "And the letters are important. Important enough that he wanted them destroyed. That makes them important." Rita nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it right." They found an old metal drum behind the diner, the kind that had once held cooking oil. They cleaned it out, set it up in the far corner of the parking lot where it wouldn't be visible from the street, and built a small fire with newspaper and kindling. When the flames were steady, Peggy opened the footlocker. The letters were organized by year, she realized. The earliest ones were from 1944, written in a young man's hand, full of fear and bravado and desperate attempts at humor. The later ones were darker, the handwriting more erratic, the words more raw. She didn't read them. She'd promised herself she wouldn't. But she couldn't help seeing fragments as she fed them to the flames. "Can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see. Wrote to Margaret, but I don't know if she'll understand." Roosevelt was right. Courage isn't about not being afraid. Sometimes I think I died over there and just forgot to stop breathing. The letters burned quickly, the old paper catching easily, the words turning to ash and smoke. Peggy and Rita stood on either side of the drum, feeding the fire, watching decades of pain and memory dissolve into nothing. It took over an hour to burn them all. When the last letter had been consumed, when nothing remained but ashes and the faint smell of burning paper, Peggy stepped back and wiped her eyes. "He's free now," Rita said quietly. "I hope so." They stood there for a long time, watching the smoke dissipate into the grey morning sky, carrying Clifford Burns's words with it, releasing them to whatever came next. If this story touched your heart, click like and subscribe to honor those who served. The weeks that followed were strange. Peggy found herself thinking about Clifford Burns at odd moments, while pouring coffee, while wiping down tables, while driving home at night. She thought about the photographs on his walls, the letters in his footlocker, the weight he'd carried for so long. And she thought about the choice he'd made at the end, to let it all go, to spend his most precious possession on something simple and ordinary, to choose happiness, even if only for a moment. It changed something in her. She couldn't quite name what it was, but she felt it. A shift in perspective, a reordering of priorities. She started paying more attention to the customers who came through the diner, really paying attention, not just taking orders and delivering food, but seeing them. The old man who came in every Thursday and always ordered the same thing. The young mother who brought her toddler in for pancakes on Saturday mornings. The construction workers who showed up at dawn, their hands already dirty, their voices loud with camaraderie. They all had stories. They were all carrying something, and she would never know what it was unless she asked, unless she made space for them to share it. So she started asking, "How are you today?" became a real question, not just a pleasantry. "Can I get you anything else?" became an invitation to conversation. "Have a good day" became a genuine wish, spoken with eye contact and intention. Some customers were surprised, some were suspicious, but some, the ones who needed it most, opened up. They told her about their lives, their struggles, their small victories and large defeats. And Peggy listened, really listened, the way she wished someone had listened to Clifford Burns before it was too late. One afternoon, about a month after the memorial service, a young man came into the diner wearing an army uniform. He was maybe 25, with a fresh haircut and nervous energy, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for threats that weren't there. Peggy seated him in the corner booth, Clifford's booth, and brought him water and a menu. "First time here?" she asked. "Yeah, just got back stateside. Someone told me this place had good pie." "Best in the state. Apple's the specialty." "I'll take a slice and coffee." Peggy brought the order, and as she set it down, she noticed his hands. They were shaking, just slightly, the same way Clifford's had shaken. "You okay?" she asked. The young man looked up at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that she recognized. The same distance, the same weight. "Yeah, just tired. Long flight, long year." Peggy pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. It was the middle of the afternoon, the diner nearly empty, and something told her this was important. "You want to talk about it?" The young man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Not really. Nobody wants to hear about it." "I do." He studied her face, looking for something. Sincerity, maybe, or just the willingness to listen without judgment. "It's not like the movies," he said finally. "It's not heroic or glorious or any of that shit they tell you when you sign up. It's just hard and boring. And then suddenly it's terrifying. And then it's boring again. And you come home and everyone expects you to be the same person you were when you left, but you're not. You can't be." "No," Peggy said softly. "You can't. And the worst part is nobody gets it. They say thank you for your service, and they mean well, but they don't actually want to know. They don't want to hear about the things you saw, the things you did. They just want you to be normal again, to fit back into the life you left behind. But you can't. But I can't." They sat in silence for a moment. The young man picked up his fork and cut into the pie, but he didn't eat it. He just moved it around on the plate, creating patterns in the filling. "There was a guy who used to come in here," Peggy said. "Older man, World War II vet. He carried the weight of that war for 80 years, never put it down, never let himself be free of it." The young man looked up. "What happened to him?" "He died. But before he did, he made a choice. He decided to let go, just for a moment, to be happy just for a moment. And I think that moment mattered more than all the years of carrying." "How do you let go?" "I don't know. I think it's different for everyone. But I think it starts with admitting you're carrying something, with not pretending you're fine when you're not." The young man was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up his coffee and took a sip. "This is good pie," he said. "Best in the state. Maybe I'll come back." "I hope you do." He finished the pie slowly, and when he was done, he left a $10 tip on a $4 check. As he walked out, he turned back at the door. "Thank you," he said, "for listening. Anytime." The bell chimed as the door closed, and Peggy sat alone in the corner booth, thinking about cycles and patterns and the way history repeated itself in small, quiet ways. The exhibit at the Smithsonian opened 3 months after Clifford Burns died, on a cold January morning when snow was falling softly on the National Mall. Peggy and Rita drove up together, leaving before dawn to beat the traffic, arriving just as the museum was opening to the public. Dr. Patricia Keene met them at the entrance, her severe expression softening into something approaching warmth when she saw them. "I'm so glad you could make it. The exhibit turned out beautifully." She led them through the vast halls of the museum, past displays of uniforms and weapons and vehicles, past dioramas of famous battles and interactive exhibits about military strategy. The World War II section was enormous, taking up an entire wing, and Peggy felt overwhelmed by the scale of it, by the sheer volume of history contained in these rooms. But then they turned a corner, and there it was. The exhibit was small, just a single case in an alcove, but it was positioned perfectly, catching the natural light from a nearby window. The dollar bill was mounted in the center, lit from above, the red ink and faded signature clearly visible. Around it were photographs. Clifford in uniform, young and hopeful. Roosevelt in his wheelchair, surrounded by soldiers. The diner with its worn booths and cracked linoleum. And below it all, the story. Not just the facts, the date, the place, the historical context, but the human story. The scared young private, the president who took time to offer comfort, the 80 years of carrying, the final choice to let go. Peggy stood in front of the case, reading the words she'd helped write, and felt tears streaming down her face. "It's perfect," she whispered. "He would have hated it," Rita said. But she was crying too. Dr. Keene smiled. "Perhaps, but he would have understood why it matters, why his story matters." They stayed for over an hour, watching as other visitors discovered the exhibit. Some walked past without stopping, drawn to the larger displays, the more dramatic artifacts. But others paused. They read the story. They looked at the photographs, and something in their expressions changed. A middle-aged man stood in front of the case for a long time, his hand pressed to the glass, his shoulders shaking. When he finally walked away, his wife put her arm around him, and Peggy heard him say, "My father was there, at Normandy. He never talked about it." An elderly woman with a walker stopped and stared at Clifford's photograph. "He looks like my brother," she said to no one in particular. "My brother who didn't come home." A young couple with a baby in a stroller read the story together, their heads close, whispering to each other. When they finished, the woman wiped her eyes and said, "We should call your grandfather. We should visit him more." This was why it mattered, Peggy realized. Not because Clifford Burns had done something extraordinary. He hadn't, not really. He'd just been a soldier, one of millions, doing what was asked of him. But his story was a mirror. It reflected back the stories of all the others, all the ones who'd served and suffered and carried their burdens in silence. And maybe, just maybe, it would help someone else make a different choice. To let go a little sooner. To find their happiness a little earlier. To not wait 80 years to spend their dollar on pie. Back in the diner, life continued. The corner booth remained popular. A destination for people who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of it. Rita had the booth reupholstered, the vinyl replaced with new material, but she kept the old piece with Clifford's carved initials and framed it on the wall beside the photograph. Peggy was promoted to assistant manager, then to manager when Rita finally retired for real. She kept everything exactly as it was, honoring the promise she'd made to preserve the story, to keep the memory alive. But she also made changes. Small ones, subtle ones, but important. She started a program where veterans ate free on Tuesdays. Not just coffee and pie, but full meals, anything on the menu. Some weeks, only 1 or 2 people took advantage of it. Other weeks, a dozen or more showed up, drawn by word of mouth, by the knowledge that here at least they were seen and valued. She put a notebook on the counter, a simple spiral-bound thing with a sign that said, "Share your story." Some people ignored it, but others wrote in it names, dates, memories, fragments of experiences they'd never told anyone else. Peggy read every entry, and once a month she typed them up and sent them to Dr. Keene at the Smithsonian, adding to the archive, ensuring that these stories wouldn't be lost. And she trained her staff differently. She taught them to see the customers, really see them, to ask questions and listen to answers, to understand that everyone who walked through the door was carrying something, and that sometimes the simple act of acknowledgement, of being seen and heard, could make all the difference. The diner became known for this, not just for the pie, though the pie was still excellent, but for the atmosphere. For the feeling that you mattered here, that your story was worth telling, that you were more than just a transaction. People started coming from farther away. Not tourists exactly, but pilgrims, people who'd heard about Clifford Burns, about the dollar bill, about the diner that honored veterans and listened to stories. They came to sit in the corner booth, to order apple pie, to add their own memories to the notebook on the counter. And slowly, quietly, the diner became something more than just a place to eat. It became a memorial, a living one, where the past and present existed side by side, where history wasn't something locked behind glass, but something you could touch and taste and be part of. 5 years after Clifford Burns died, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, an old car pulled into the diner's parking lot. It was a Buick from the 80s, faded blue paint and rust around the wheel wells, the kind of car that had been driven hard and maintained minimally. The driver who emerged was a woman in her 70s, moving slowly, using a cane for support. She stood in the parking lot for a long moment, staring at the diner, her expression unreadable. Peggy watched from inside, something prickling at the back of her neck. There was something familiar about the woman, though she couldn't place what it was. The woman finally made her way inside, the bell chiming as she entered. She stood just inside the door, looking around, taking in the worn booths and the cracked linoleum and the framed photograph on the wall. "Can I help you?" Peggy asked, approaching with a menu. The woman turned to look at her, and Peggy saw that her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and distant and achingly familiar. "I'm looking for the booth," the woman said, "the one where my uncle sat." Peggy's heart stopped. "Your uncle?" "Clifford Burns. I'm Margaret's daughter, his niece." The world tilted sideways. Peggy grabbed the counter to steady herself. "I didn't know he had family. At the funeral they said, I know what they said, that he was alone, that no one claimed him." The woman's voice was tight with something that might have been anger or grief or both. "That's not entirely true." Peggy led her to the corner booth, the one with the framed piece of vinyl on the wall above it. The woman slid in slowly, her cane propped against the table, and stared at the initials carved into the frame. "He did that in 1945, she said softly. "Right after he came home from the war. My mother brought him here, trying to help him readjust. He sat in this booth and carved his initials and told her he'd never be the same." "I'm so sorry," Peggy said. "I didn't know. At the funeral, no one. I was in California. I didn't find out he died until 2 weeks later. By then, everything was already done. The funeral, the burial, all of it." The woman's hands were shaking, the same tremor Peggy had seen in Clifford's hands. "I tried to reach him, you know. For years I tried. I sent letters, made phone calls, but he never responded. Eventually I stopped trying. I thought he didn't want contact. I thought he'd moved on." "He kept your photograph," Peggy said quietly. "On his wall. You and your mother and your children. He kept all of them." "Woods?" The woman looked up sharply. "You saw his apartment? After he died, I wanted to make sure nothing important was lost. And was there? Anything important?" Peggy thought about the letters, about the box full of words that had been burned and released to the sky, about the photographs on the walls, the evidence of a life lived in the margins, connected to others but always at a distance. "There were letters," she said carefully. "He wanted them burned. He left instructions. Did you read them?" "No. He asked that they not be read, so I didn't." The woman was quiet for a long time, staring at the carved initials. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. "I brought this. I thought maybe, I don't know what I thought. That I'd find some closure, maybe, some understanding." She handed the envelope to Peggy. Inside was a letter, written in a young woman's hand, dated 1968. "Dear Uncle Cliff, I know you don't want to hear from us. I know you've made your choice to be alone. But I need you to know that we don't blame you. We don't think less of you. We understand that the war changed you, that you can't be who you were before. But please know that we love you. We miss you. And if you ever want to come home, the door is always open." Your niece, Sarah Peggy, read the letter twice, her throat tight. "You sent this." "I sent dozens like it. Over the years, I never got a response." "He kept them," Peggy said. "I saw them in his apartment. He kept every one." Sarah's face crumpled. "Then why didn't he answer? Why didn't he let us in?" "I don't know. Maybe he thought he was protecting you. Maybe he thought the weight he was carrying was too heavy to share." "That's stupid. That's so stupid." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered face. "We would have helped. We would have carried it with him. I know, but I don't think he could see that. I think all he could see was the burden, and he didn't want to pass it on." They sat in silence, two women mourning a man who died years ago, mourning the connection that had been lost, the love that had been offered and refused. Finally, Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at Peggy. "Tell me about the end. Tell me about the day he came here." So Peggy told her. About the rain and the pie and the dollar bill with the red seal. About the signature and the story and the choice Clifford had made to finally, after 80 years, let himself be happy. "He said the pie made him happy," Peggy finished. "He said that's what he was fighting for. The right to come home and be happy." Sarah smiled through her tears. "That sounds like him. Always making it about something simple, something ordinary." "There's an exhibit," Peggy said, "at the Smithsonian, about the dollar bill and his story. You should see it." "I will. I'll go tomorrow." "And there's something else." Peggy stood and retrieved the notebook from the counter, the one where people shared their stories. She opened it to a page near the middle and handed it to Sarah. The entry was dated 6 months earlier, written in a shaky hand. "My name is Clifford Burns. I'm 81 years old, and I'm tired. Tired of carrying the past. Tired of being alone. Tired of pretending I'm fine when I'm not. But today, I made a choice. I decided to spend my last dollar on something that makes me happy. And I want everyone who reads this to know, it's never too late. It's never too late to let go. It's never too late to choose happiness. Don't wait as long as I did. Don't carry the weight until it crushes you. Put it down. Let it go. Be happy. That's all. That's everything." Sarah read the entry 3 times, her fingers tracing the words, and when she looked up, her face was transformed. The grief was still there, but so was something else. Peace, maybe, or understanding. "He did let go," she whispered. "At the end, he let go. He did, and he was happy. He was." Sarah closed the notebook carefully and handed it back to Peggy. "Thank you for being here, for listening to him, for making sure his story wasn't forgotten. It's an honor." Sarah stood, gathering her cane and her purse. "I'd like to come back if that's all right. I'd like to sit here sometimes and feel close to him. Anytime. The booth is always available. And I'd like to add to the notebook. I have stories about him, about who he was before the war. I think people should know that too." "I think that would be wonderful." Sarah walked to the door, then turned back. "He loved apple pie, you know, even as a kid. My mother used to make it for him every Sunday. Then he came to the right place. The bell chimed as Sarah left, and Peggy stood alone in the diner, holding the notebook, thinking about circles closing and stories finding their endings. The years continued to pass. Sarah became a regular, coming in every Tuesday to sit in the corner booth and write in the notebook. She filled pages with memories of Clifford as a young man, his sense of humor, his kindness, his dreams of becoming a teacher before the war changed everything. Other family members started coming too, cousins and second cousins, and people who'd heard the story and wanted to connect with it. The corner booth became a gathering place, a spot where the past and present intersected, where Clifford Burns was remembered not just as a veteran or a symbol, but as a person, flawed and complicated and human. The exhibit at the Smithsonian expanded. Dr. Keene added Sarah's stories, along with photographs from the family archive. The display now showed Clifford's full life, before, during, and after the war, giving context to the choice he'd made at the end. And the notebook at the diner continued to fill. Veterans wrote about their experiences. Family members wrote about loved ones they'd lost. Ordinary people wrote about the burdens they carried and the moments when they'd chosen to let go. Peggy read every entry, and she was struck by how similar they all were. Different wars, different circumstances, different lives, but the same themes running through them all: fear, sacrifice, loss, and the desperate search for peace. And always, always the question: how do you let go? How do you put down the weight you've been carrying? How do you choose happiness when you've forgotten what happiness feels like? There were no easy answers, but the stories themselves seemed to help, the act of writing them down. of sharing them, of knowing that someone else would read them and understand. That seemed to matter. 10 years after Clifford Burns died, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, Peggy stood in the diner looking at the corner booth. Sarah had passed away the previous spring, peacefully in her sleep, and her children had held a small memorial service at the diner, gathering in the booth where their great-uncle had spent his last meal. The booth was empty now, waiting for the next person who needed it. The framed vinyl with the carved initials hung on the wall, a silent testament to a moment in 1945 when a young man had tried to mark his existence, to prove he was still here. The notebook was nearly full. Peggy would need to start a new one soon, to archive the old one and send it to Dr. Keene for the collection. But before she did, she opened it to a blank page and picked up a pen. She'd never written in the notebook before. It was for customers, for people with stories to share. But today felt different. Today felt like an ending and a beginning, and she wanted to mark it somehow. She wrote, "My name is Peggy Martinez. 10 years ago, a man walked into this diner and changed my life. He didn't mean to. He just wanted pie. But in the simple act of ordering and eating and paying, he taught me something profound. He taught me that we all carry weight. We all have burdens. We all have pasts that haunt us and futures that terrify us. But we also have choices. We can choose to carry the weight forever, or we can choose to put it down, even if only for a moment." Clifford Burns carried his weight for 80 years. And then, for the space of a slice of pie and a cup of coffee, he let it go. He chose happiness. He chose peace. And that choice rippled outward. It touched me. It touched everyone who heard his story. It's still touching people today, 10 years later. Because the story isn't really about him. It's about all of us. It's about the universal human struggle to find meaning and peace in a world that offers neither easily. So, if you're reading this, know that your story matters. Your burden matters. Your choice to carry or to let go, that matters too. Don't wait 80 years. Don't wait until the end. Choose happiness now. Choose peace now. Choose to put down the weight, even if only for a moment. That's what Clifford Burns taught me. That's what I hope I can teach others. That's the legacy of a man who spent his last dollar on pie. She closed the notebook and set it back on the counter. Outside, the November rain was starting to fall, turning the world grey and soft. Inside, the diner was warm and bright, full of the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and apple pie cooling on the counter. The bell above the door chimed, and a customer walked in, an old man, moving slowly, his jacket worn thin at the elbows. Peggy grabbed a menu and approached with a smile. "Welcome to Rosie's. Can I get you some coffee?" The man nodded and she poured, watching the dark liquid fill the cup. He wrapped both hands around it, drawing warmth, and she saw that his hands were trembling. "You know what you want? Or do you need a minute?" "Apple pie," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "If you got it." "We do. Best in the state." She wrote it down, even though she didn't need to, and walked back to the counter. As she slid the order through to the kitchen, she looked back at the old man sitting in the corner booth, and she smiled. Another story, another burden, another chance to listen, to see, to help someone find their moment of peace. This was the work. This was what mattered. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, but the small ones. the quiet ones, the choice to see someone, to hear them, to make space for their story. That was Clifford Burns's legacy, not the dollar bill or the exhibit or the fame that came after, but this, the simple act of paying attention, of caring, of remembering that every person who walks through the door is carrying something, and that sometimes all they need is someone to acknowledge it. The pie came up in the window, and Peggy carried it over, setting it down with a fresh napkin and fork. "Anything else I can get you?" The old man looked up at her with pale eyes, and for a moment she saw Clifford Burns looking back. "No," he said softly, "this is perfect." And it was. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community.